Story 1. The Cursed Lake. This story is about a small town that harbors a dark secret. Every summer, like clockwork, someone drowns in the lake just outside of town. The locals believe the lake is cursed, and each death is not a mere accident, but part of a terrifying cycle linked to a hidden secret beneath the water's surface. As the narrator, I will share the unsettling events that unfolded during one fateful summer when I visited the town, driven by curiosity and a desire to uncover the truth. The lake looked serene and inviting, its surface reflecting the pale blue sky. As I stood on the shore, the soft breeze rustling the nearby trees. But there was an unsettling stillness about the place, a quiet that felt unnatural, almost as if the lake itself was holding its breath. I had heard the stories, of course. Everybody in town had. The whispers about the lake's curse, the tales of those who had drowned, and the dark secrets that supposedly lay beneath the placid waters. I had always been skeptical of such things, chalking it up to local superstition. But when I arrived in the town, there was something in the air, a heavy, oppressive feeling that seemed to weigh down on everyone. The townspeople were wary, their eyes avoiding mine when I asked about the lake. It was as if even mentioning it would somehow bring about another tragedy. The old man at the general store was the first to speak to me about it, his voice low and gravelly, like he was sharing a dangerous secret. "You shouldn't go near that lake, son," he warned, his weathered face serious. "It's not safe, especially not in the summer. Folks around here know better than to get too close. What makes it so dangerous?" I asked, trying to sound casual, though the man's warning he looked around as if to make sure no one else was listening before he leaned in closer. "They say the lake is cursed. Every summer, like clockwork, someone drowns in that water, and it ain't an ordinary drowning either. There's something unnatural about it, like the lake takes them, pulls them under, and don't let go." I tried to laugh it off, but his words stayed with me. As much as I wanted to dismiss it as just another ghost story, there was something in his eyes, a deep-seated fear that made me reconsider. At night, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept drifting back to the lake, to the stories I had heard. I knew I had to see it for myself to understand what was really going on. So the next morning, I packed a bag and set out for the lake, determined to uncover the truth. The path leading to the lake was overgrown, as if nature itself was trying to keep people away. As I walked, the trees grew denser, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the sun. The air was thick and humid, silence broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves underfoot. When I finally reached the lake, I was struck by how different it felt from the previous day. The water was still too still, like a sheet of glass that hid something sinister beneath. The breeze that had been so gentle before had died down completely, leaving the air heavy and stagnant. I stood at the edge of the lake, staring out at the water, trying to shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in the pit of my stomach. There was nothing outwardly terrifying about the lake, but there was something wrong, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. As I watched, the surface of the lake began to ripple, small waves lapping against the shore as if something was stirring beneath the water. My heart started to race, and I took a step back, suddenly unsure of my decision to come here alone. But then the ripples stopped, the water once again returning to its eerie stillness. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding and shook my head, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. I decided to explore the area around the lake, hoping to find something, anything that would explain the stories I had heard. As I walked along the shore, I noticed something strange. The ground near the water was soft, almost muddy, but there were no footprints. It was as if no one had been here a long time, despite the stories of people coming to the lake every summer. And then I saw it. Something sticking out of the mud, partially hidden by a tangle of reeds. I bent down to get a closer look and realized it was an old, rusted key. I picked it up, turning it over in my hand, wondering how it had ended up there. It was heavy, made of iron, with an intricate design that suggested it was very old. And I looked around, but there was no sign of what the key might belong to. The houses near the lake had long since fallen into disrepair, and the few that remained were abandoned, their windows boarded up, their doors hanging off their hinges. It was as if the lake had driven everyone away, leaving only the echoes of the past behind. I slipped the key into my pocket, intending to keep it as a memento of my visit. But as I stood up, I felt a sudden chill run down my spine. The air had grown colder, and the sky, which had been clear and bright, was now overcast, the sun hidden behind a thick blanket of clouds. I turned to leave, but something stopped me. A feeling of being watched, of something lurking just out of sight. I spun around, my eyes scanning the trees, the water, the empty houses, but there was nothing. Just the lake, still and silent, as if it was waiting for something. I shook my head, trying to dispel the growing sense of unease. It was just a lake, I told myself. Just a body of water, like any other. But as I made my way back to town, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. The following days were a blur of strange events. I couldn't sleep, plagued by nightmares of drowning, of being pulled under the water by unseen hands. The key I had found weighed heavily in my pocket, a constant reminder of the lake and the mysteries. I tried to talk to the townspeople, to learn more about the lake's history, but they were tight-lipped, refusing to speak about it. It was as if they were afraid, not just of the lake, but of what I might discover if I kept asking questions. But I couldn't stop. The more I learned, the more I needed to know. I spent hours at the local library, poring over old newspapers and records, trying to piece together the story of the lake. What I found was disturbing. The drownings had been happening for as long as anyone could remember, stretching back over 100 years. And each one was the same. A person would go missing, their body later found in the lake, with no signs of struggle, no explanation for how they had drowned. But there was something else, something that hadn't been mentioned in the stories. Each of the victims had been found clutching something in their hand. An old, rusted key, just like the one I had found. I knew then that I had to go back to the lake, to find out what those keys unlocked, and to put an end to whatever curse had taken hold of the town. As I made my way back to the lake, the sky darkened, and the wind picked up, whipping through the trees with a fury that seemed almost unnatural. The lake was just as I had left it, still and silent, but there was something different now, a tension in the air that made my heart race. I took out the key, holding it in my hand as I approached the water's edge. The wind howled around me, the trees bending under its force, but the lake remained undisturbed, its surface smooth as glass. I knew what I had to do. I stepped into the water, feeling the cold seep into my bones as I waded out, the key held tightly in my fist. The water was deeper than I had expected, reaching up to my chest, but I kept going, my eyes fixed on the center of the lake. And then, as if in response to my presence, the water began to churn. Small ripples grew into waves, pulling at my legs, trying to drag me under. But I held firm, the key burning in my hand as I fought to keep my footing. The waves grew stronger, the water swirling around me like a whirlpool, and I knew I was close. The key was the answer, I was sure of it, but I didn't know what to do. I looked down at the key, and in that moment, it all became clear. The key wasn't just a key. It was a symbol, a token of those who had come before, those who had been claimed by the lake. And now it was my turn. I took a deep breath and let go of the key, watching as it sank into the water, disappearing into the darkness below. The waves intensified, crashing against me with a force that nearly knocked me off my feet. But I stood my ground, waiting. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the water stilled. The lake was calm once more, the wind dying down to a gentle breeze. I stood there, chest deep in the water, my breath coming in ragged gasps, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. The lake was silent, peaceful, as if nothing had happened at all. I felt a strange sense of relief, as if a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. I turned to leave, but something caught my eye. A faint glow deep below the surface where the key had disappeared. It was faint at first, barely visible, but it grew brighter, pulsating with a soft, eerie light. I hesitated, unsure of what to do. But then, as if compelled by some unseen force, I found myself wading back toward the light, the water growing deeper with each step. The glow intensified, and I could see something beneath the surface, something large and dark, buried in the silt at the bottom of the lake. It was too deep to see clearly, but I could feel it. A presence. Something ancient and malevolent. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached out, my hand brushing against the rough surface of whatever lay beneath the water. It was cold, impossibly cold, and as my fingers made contact, a jolt of electricity shot through me, knocking the breath from my lungs. I gasped, stumbling back, but the pull was too strong. The water around me churned once more, the waves rising up to engulf me, and I knew then that there was no escape. The lake had claimed me, just as it had claimed so many others before me. The last thing I saw was the glow, growing brighter and brighter until it was all I could see, all I could feel, and then there was nothing. The light consumed me, and for a moment, I lost all sense of time and space. It felt as though I were suspended in a void where there was no up, no down, no horizon. The water that had surrounded me seemed to vanish, and I found myself in a strange state between wakefulness and sleep. In this silence, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if something ancient and malevolent was watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. As the light slowly faded, I became aware of my surroundings again. I was no longer in the lake, but in a vast, dark chamber, the walls of which seemed to be made of rough stone, slick with moisture. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. I could hear the distant sound of water dripping, echoing through the chamber, and the occasional rustle of something moving in the shadows. I tried to stand, but my legs felt weak, as if I hadn't used them in a long time. My clothes were soaked, and the chill in the air seeped into my bones. I shivered, feeling a deep sense of unease. I had no idea where I was or how I had gotten here. The last thing I remembered was the glow beneath the surface of the lake, and the cold, electric jolt that had shot through me when I touched whatever was buried in the silt. I took a cautious step forward, my hand brushing against the rough stone wall for support. The chamber seemed to stretch on endlessly with no visible exit. The light was dim, emanating from some unseen source high above, casting long, eerie shadows that danced across the walls. As I ventured deeper into the chamber, I began to notice strange markings on the walls, symbols carved into the stone that looked ancient and worn. They were unlike anything I had ever seen before, twisting and turning in intricate patterns that made my head ache just to look at them. I couldn't shake the feeling that these symbols were important, that they held some kind of key to understanding what was happening to me. The further I went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The air was thick with tension, as if the very walls were watching me, waiting for something. I couldn't tell if it was my imagination, but I started to hear whispers, soft and indistinct, just on the edge of my hearing. They seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, growing louder and more urgent the deeper I went. Then I saw it. A massive stone door at the far end of the chamber, partially concealed by the shadows. It was covered in the same strange symbols, glowing faintly in the dim light. The door seemed ancient, and yet there was something unnervingly familiar about it, as if I had seen it before, perhaps in a dream. As I approached the door, the whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if warning me to turn back. But something compelled me to press on, to uncover whatever secrets lay beyond that door. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached out, my hand trembling, and touched the cold, rough surface of the stone. The door shuddered under my touch, the symbols flaring brightly for a moment before fading again. With a low, grinding sound, the door began to open, revealing a dark, narrow passageway that seemed to descend deep into the earth. A cold, stale breeze wafted out from the passage, carrying with it the scent of decay and something else, something ancient and foul. I hesitated at the threshold, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, to flee while I still could. But the pull was too strong, and before I knew it, I was stepping into the passageway, the door closing behind me with a resounding thud that echoed through the chamber. The passage was long and winding, the walls closing in around me as I descended deeper into the darkness. The air grew colder, the smell of decay more intense, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. I could feel them now, not just in my ears but in my mind, gnawing at my thoughts, filling me with dread. As I continued to walk, I noticed that the walls of the passage were lined with more of the strange symbols, though these were different. Darker, more twisted, as if corrupted by some malevolent force. The light from the chamber above had long since faded, leaving me in near total darkness, save for the faint glow of the symbols. And then I reached the end of the passage, where it opened into another chamber. This one even larger than the first, with a high vaulted ceiling that seemed to stretch up into infinity. In the center of the chamber was a pool of water, black as night, its surface perfectly still. The air was thick with an unnatural silence, the whispers suddenly gone, as if they had never been there at all. I approached the pool, drawn to it by some unseen force. The water was so dark that it seemed to absorb all light, reflecting nothing back. I knelt by the edge, peering into the depths, and saw nothing. Only darkness, infinite and unyielding. But then something stirred beneath the surface. A faint ripple, barely perceptible, but enough to send a shiver down my spine. I leaned closer, my breath catching in my throat, as I watched the ripple spread across the pool, growing larger and larger. And then it appeared. A figure rising slowly from the depths, its form indistinct at first, but becoming clearer with each passing moment. It was humanoid but twisted, misshapen, as if warped by whatever dark forces had cursed this place. Its eyes were hollow, empty sockets that seemed to bore into my very soul, and its skin was pale, almost translucent, covered in what looked like scars or burns. I tried to back away, but my body wouldn't respond, frozen in place by fear or some unseen force. The figure continued to rise, its gaze never leaving mine, until it was fully out of the water, standing before me. It reached out a hand, its fingers long and skeletal, and I felt a cold, icy grip on my arm. The touch sent a jolt of terror through me. I finally managed to pull away, stumbling back and falling to the ground. The figure didn't move, just stood there, watching me with those hollow eyes, its mouth slowly opening to speak. But no words came out. Only a low, guttural sound, like the groan of something ancient and long forgotten. The sound grew louder, more intense, filling the chamber, reverberating off the walls until it felt like the very ground was shaking beneath me. I scrambled to my feet, my heart racing, and turned to flee, but the passage behind me was gone, replaced by solid stone. I was trapped, with no way out, no escape from the horror that had been unleashed. The figure began to move toward me slowly, deliberately, its gaze never leaving mine. I could feel the coldness of its presence, the weight of the curse that had plagued this place for centuries. And in that moment, I knew. This was the source of the drownings, the curse that had claimed so many lives over the years. It was coming for me now, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. As the figure drew closer, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. The fear that had gripped me moments before began to fade, replaced by a deep, abiding sorrow. I understood now. The curse wasn't just a malevolent force, but a tragedy, a dark history that had been buried beneath the lake for too long. And then, just as the figure reached out to touch me again, I heard it, a voice, soft and distant, calling my name. It was familiar, comforting, and it filled me with a renewed sense of hope. I turned toward the source of the voice, and there, in the darkness, I saw a faint light, growing brighter with each passing second. It was warm, inviting, and it beckoned me toward it, away from the darkness, away from the curse. I took a step toward the light, and then another, until I was running, the cold grip of the curse slipping away with each step. The figure behind me let out a wail, a sound of despair and anger, but I didn't look back. I just kept running toward the light, toward freedom. The lights grew brighter and brighter until it was all I could see, all I could feel. And then, with a final burst of energy, I leapt into the light, leaving the darkness behind. When I opened my eyes, I was back on the shore of the lake, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my chest. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a warm, golden light across the water. The nightmare was over and I was free. But as I looked out at the lake, I knew that the curse was still there, waiting, lurking beneath the surface. It wasn't over. Not yet. The lake would claim another and another, until the truth was finally uncovered, until the curse was broken. And as I walked away from the lake, I knew that it was my responsibility to uncover that truth, to put an end to the curse once and for all. But that is a story for another time. Story 2. Missing Neighbor. This story is about a seemingly ordinary man who lives in a quiet apartment building where nothing unusual ever happens. But one day, the man notices something strange. His neighbor, with whom he often spoke, has suddenly vanished. When he tries to find out where his neighbor went, he discovers that no one else in the building remembers this neighbor. They all claim that the neighbor never existed. What follows is a chilling journey into the unknown, as the man struggles to uncover the truth about his missing neighbor, and to doing so, he unravels a terrifying mystery that shakes the foundations of his reality. The building I live in is old, with creaking floors and a smell of dampness that never quite goes away. It's a place where people mind their own business, keeping to themselves, nodding politely in the elevator, but rarely exchanging more than a few words. It suited me just fine. I wasn't looking for companionship or a sense of community. I liked the anonymity, the quiet. It was, in a word, comfort. I had lived there for almost 5 years, on the 5th floor in a small but cozy apartment with a view of the street below. My neighbor, Mr. Harper, lived across the hall. He was an unremarkable man in many ways. Middle-aged, a bit balding, with a stooped posture and a penchant for old wool cardigans. We weren't friends, but we were friendly. We would occasionally chat in the hallway, discussing the weather, the state of the building, or the latest news. He always had a book in hand, and I often wondered if he had read every book in his small, cluttered apartment. It was a Thursday evening, I remember, when I first noticed something odd. I had just returned from work and was unlocking my door when I realized that I hadn't seen Mr. Harper in a few days. It wasn't unusual for us to miss each other, but something felt different this time. His door was slightly ajar, and there was a faint smell of something sour drifting from inside. I hesitated for a moment, my hand on the doorknob before deciding to knock. No answer. I pushed the door open a little wider and called out his name. The apartment was dark, the only light coming from the street lamp outside. The smell was stronger now, a mix of spoiled food and something else, something metallic. "Mr. Harper?" I called again, stepping inside. The apartment looked exactly as I remembered it. Piles of books everywhere, the furniture old and worn, a thick layer of dust covering everything. But something was off. There was a sense of disarray, as if someone had left in a hurry. The table in the small kitchen was set for one, a plate of what looked like a half-eaten sandwich covered in mold. The smell was coming from the refrigerator, which was slightly open, revealing spoiled food and something I couldn't quite identify, hidden in the shadows. I felt a chill run down my spine and quickly backed out of the apartment, closing the door behind me. I told myself that Mr. Harper had probably gone away for a few days and forgotten to clean out his fridge. It was plausible, but the unease in my gut wouldn't go away. The next morning I knocked on the door again. This time, I was more insistent, pounding my fist against the wood until my knuckles hurt. Still, there was no answer. I went down to the building manager's office to ask if Mr. Harper had mentioned going on a trip or if anyone had seen him. The manager, an older woman with sharp eyes and a stern demeanor, looked at me as if I had lost my mind. "Who?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "Mr. Harper," I repeated, feeling a sudden sense of dread. "He lives on my floor across the..." Her eyes narrowed, and she shook her head slowly. "There's no one by that name living here, dear. I've been managing this building for 10 years, and I know everyone who's come and gone." I stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. It didn't make any sense. I had spoken to Mr. Harper just last week, hadn't I? I asked her if I could check the tenant records, but she refused, citing privacy concerns. I was left standing in the hallway, my mind racing. Over the next few days, I asked around the building, trying to find anyone who remembered Mr. Harper. No one did. The old couple on the 3rd floor, the single mother with 2 kids on the 2nd, the elderly man with the hearing aid who always sat in the lobby. All of them looked at me with the same blank expression. Some of them even seemed annoyed that I was bothering them with such nonsense. It was as if Mr. Harper had never existed. But I knew that wasn't true. I had seen him, spoken to him, even borrowed a book from him once. I searched my apartment for that book, tearing through my shelves, but it was nowhere to be found. My frustration grew, turning into something darker, a gnawing fear that I couldn't shake. I returned to Mr. Harper's apartment, determined to find some proof of his existence. The door was still unlocked, and I let myself in, closing the door behind me. The apartment was in the same state of disarray as before, but this time I was more focused, methodically searching every corner. I opened drawers, flipped through books, even checked under the bed, but there was nothing, no sign of Mr. Harper anywhere. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. I was about to leave when I noticed something odd about the bookshelf in the living room. One of the shelves seemed out of place, slightly crooked. I pulled on it, and to my surprise, the entire bookshelf swung open, revealing a hidden room behind it. My heart raced as I stepped inside. The room was small, barely more than a closet, and filled with strange objects. Old photographs, newspaper clippings, and what looked like handwritten journals were scattered across a small desk. The air was thick with dust, and I had to cover my mouth to keep from coughing. I picked up one of the photographs and felt a chill run down my spine. It was a picture of Mr. Harper, but he looked different. Older, gaunter, with a haunted look in his eyes. The back of the photograph was dated over 20 years ago. I quickly rifled through the other photos, all of them showing Mr. Harper at various stages of his life, but always looking slightly off, as if he were slowly fading away. The journals were filled with ramblings, disjointed thoughts that made little sense. But one entry caught my eye. It was dated a few days before I had last seen Mr. Harper, and they're coming for me. I can feel it. They've erased everyone's memories of me, and soon I'll be gone too. If anyone finds this, please remember me. I existed. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead as I read the words. My hands trembled as I put the journal down and backed out of the room, the fear growing with each step. I couldn't explain what was happening, but I knew one thing for certain. Harper had been real. And now, he was gone, erased from everyone's memory except mine. I hurried back to my apartment, locking the door behind me. I sat in the dark for what felt like hours, trying to make sense of everything. Was I losing my mind? Had I imagined everything? But the fear gnawing at my insides told me otherwise. Over the next few days, things only got worse. I started hearing noises in the hallway late at night. Footsteps, whispers, the sound of someone crying. But every time I opened my door, there was no one there. The building itself seemed to be changing too. The walls closing in, the shadows growing darker, more oppressive. And then, one night, I woke up to find my door wide open. I had locked it before going to bed. I was sure of it. My heart pounded in my chest as I got up, grabbing a baseball bat I kept under my bed for protection. I slowly walked towards the door, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. There was no one in the hallway, but something felt wrong. The air was thick, heavy, as if something unseen was watching me. I stepped out into the hallway, my hands trembling, and that's when I saw it. A figure standing at the end of the hall, barely visible in the dim light. It was tall, impossibly tall, and shrouded in darkness. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its eyes on me, boring into my soul. I backed away, my heart racing, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there watching. I turned and ran back into my apartment, slamming the door shut and locking it. I leaned against the door, trying to catch my breath, my mind racing. That was the last straw. I knew I had to get out of there, leave the building, and never come back. I packed a bag with whatever I could find, not caring about what I left behind. As I hurried out of the apartment, I took one last look at Mr. Harper's door. It was closed now, as if nothing had ever happened. But I knew better. I left the building that night, not caring where I was going. I just needed to get away as far away as possible. But even as I drove through the dark, empty streets, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That whatever had taken Mr. Harper was still out there waiting. And the worst part, I couldn't remember his face anymore. I drove for hours that night, through empty streets and deserted highways, not really knowing where I was going. The city seemed endless, a labyrinth of darkened buildings and silent intersections. The thought of stopping, of looking back, terrified me, so I just kept driving, hoping that distance would somehow free me from the suffocating fear that had taken hold of me. When I finally stopped, it was in a small, nondescript town miles away from the city. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a faint light over the quiet streets. I found a cheap motel on the edge of town and checked in, paying cash to avoid leaving any trace. The woman at the front desk gave me a strange look, probably noticing the wild look in my eyes, but she didn't ask any questions. I was grateful for that. The room was small and dingy, with peeling wallpaper and a faint smell of mildew, but I didn't care. I collapsed onto the bed, exhaustion overwhelming me, and fell into a restless sleep filled with nightmares. In my dreams, I was back in the building, walking down the hallway towards Mr. Harper's door. The door was ajar, and as I reached out to push it open, something grabbed my wrist, cold and bony. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The door swung open on its own, revealing a dark, endless void. And then I was falling, tumbling through the darkness, with whispers all around me, telling me to forget, to let go. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was still dark, the only light coming from the flickering neon sign outside the window. I sat up, trying to shake off the lingering sense of dread. The dreams felt too real, too vivid, as if they were more than just figments of my imagination. I tried to calm myself, telling myself that I was safe, that whatever had happened in that building was far behind me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The fear was still there, gnawing at the edges of my mind, refusing to let go. Over the next few days, I stayed in the motel, trying to figure out what to do next. I avoided the news, the internet, anything that might remind me of what I had left behind. I knew I couldn't go back, but I couldn't stay here forever either. The thought of starting over somewhere new, far away from the city, was tempting, but it felt like running away, like admitting defeat. And then, one morning, as I was sitting in the motel's tiny dining area, sipping on a cup of bitter coffee, I overheard a conversation that made my blood run cold. Two men were sitting at a nearby table, talking in low voices. I wasn't really paying attention until I heard one of them mention a disappearance. Just like that guy in the city, one of the men said, shaking his head. Just vanished without a trace. No one remembers him, not even his own family. My heart skipped a beat. I leaned in closer, trying to hear more, but the men quickly changed the subject, moving on to something mundane. I sat there, frozen, my mind racing. It couldn't be a coincidence. There was no way it could be. I had to know more. After breakfast, I went to the town's small library, hoping to find something, anything, that might explain what was happening. The librarian, a kind elderly woman, helped me find the archives, where I spent hours poring over old newspapers and records. At first, I found nothing, just the usual local news, but then I stumbled across an article from over 20 years ago that sent chills down my spine. The article was about a man who had gone missing in the city, my city. According to the report, the man had lived alone in an apartment building and was well liked by his neighbors. One day, he simply vanished. The police searched for him, but there were no leads, no signs of foul play. The most disturbing part was the follow-up article, dated a few weeks later, which claimed that the man's neighbors no longer remembered him. They insisted that no one by that name had ever lived in the building. It was the same story as Mr. Harper's, the same airy details, the same inexplicable disappearance. And it wasn't the only one. Over the years, there had been other similar cases, people who vanished without a trace, their existence erased from the memories of those who knew them. It was as if they had never existed at all. I left the library in a daze, my mind spinning with questions. What was happening? Why was this happening? And most important, could it happen to me? The fear that had been lurking in the back of my mind now took hold with full force. I had to do something, but I didn't know what. The logical part of me wanted to believe that there was a rational explanation, that these were just isolated incidents, but the other part, The part that had seen the figure in the hallway, knew better. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that dark figure, standing at the end of the hall, watching me. I knew I had to get out of town, keep moving, but I was paralyzed by fear, afraid that no matter where I went, it would follow me. The next morning, I packed my bags and checked out of the motel, deciding to head west, to the coast. I drove for hours, only stopping for gas, trying to put as much distance between myself and the city as possible. But as the miles passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, that I was being watched. I arrived in a small coastal town just as the sun was setting. The ocean was a deep, foreboding gray, the waves crashing against the rocky shore. I found another motel, this one even more run-down than the last, and checked in, barely acknowledging the bored-looking clerk at the front desk. On that, the nightmares returned, more vivid and terrifying than before. This time, I wasn't in the hallway. I was in Mr. Harper's apartment, standing in the hidden room behind the bookshelf. The walls were closing in, the shadows growing darker, the whispers were louder now, insistent, telling me to forget, to let go, to give in. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart racing. The room was dark, but something was different. The air was thick, heavy, and I could feel a presence, something unseen, watching me. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just a dream, but the fear was too real, too palpable. I got up, turning on the light, and that's when I saw it. Written on the mirror in what looked like blood was a single word. I stumbled back, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Was it a message? A warning, or was I finally losing my mind? I had to get out, and I grabbed my bag and bolted from the room, not caring about the noise I was making. I ran to my car, fumbling with the keys. My hands trembling, I started the engine and sped out of the parking lot, not looking back. I drove through the night, my mind racing with fear and confusion. What was happening to me? Why was this happening? And what did that message mean? As dawn approached, I found myself on a deserted stretch of highway, the ocean on one side and cliffs on the other. I pulled over, my hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to calm down. But the fear wouldn't go away, and the sense of being watched was stronger than ever. I looked in the rearview mirror, and my heart nearly stopped. There, in the back seat, was a shadowy figure, its eyes glowing with a cold, malevolent light. I spun around, but the seat was empty. I knew then that I couldn't run from this, whatever it was. It would follow me no matter where I went, and it wouldn't stop until it had me. I had to go back. I had to return to the city, to the building, to Mr. Harper's apartment. I had to find out the truth, no matter the cost. The drive back was a blur, my mind consumed with fear and determination. I arrived in the city just as night fell, the streets dark and empty. The building loomed ahead, its windows like black, soulless eyes. I parked the car and made my way to the entrance, my heart pounding in my chest. The elevator ride up to the 5th floor was agonizingly slow, the air thick with tension. When the doors finally opened, I stepped out into the hallway, the familiar smell of dampness and decay filling my nostrils. I walked to Mr. Harper's door, my hand shaking as I reached for the doorknob. The door was unlocked, just as it had been before. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The apartment was exactly as I had left it, dark and cluttered, with a faint smell of mold lingering in the air. I made my way to the bookshelf, my heart pounding in my ears. I pulled on the crooked shelf, and once again the hidden room. I stepped inside, the air heavy with dust and decay. The photographs and journals were still there, scattered across the desk, but something was different. The shadows were darker, more oppressive, and I could feel the presence, stronger now, as if it was waiting for me. I picked up one of the photographs, my hands trembling as I examined it. The photo showed Mr. Harper with a group of people I didn't recognize, their faces etched with a mixture of fear and determination. The center was a man who looked strikingly similar to me, and my blood ran cold. The resemblance was uncanny. I felt a wave of dizziness wash over me as I stumbled backward, dropping the photograph. It fluttered to the ground, revealing another hidden picture underneath. I picked it up, my hands now shaking uncontrollably. The photograph was old, faded, and yellowed with age. It depicted a different scene. A group of people standing in front of the same apartment building, but from a time long before I was born. There was a date written on the bottom. Exactly 30 years ago. I scanned the faces in the photo and froze. Among the crowd was a younger version of Mr. Harper and myself. I tried to make sense of it, but the room began to spin. My heart raced as I looked around the hidden chamber. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows growing darker and more malevolent. The whispers were back, louder now, filling the air with an almost tangible presence. In the midst of my panic, a figure stepped out of the shadows, a spectral apparition with a hollow, soulless gaze. It was Mr. Harper, or at least a version of him. His eyes were empty voids, his form flickering like a dying flame. Why? I choked out, stumbling backward. Why are you doing this? Mr. Harper's ghostly form seemed to waver, his voice echoing with 1,000 other voices. You were never meant to remember. You were one of us, and now you've awakened the cycle. Before I could react, the room began to twist and distort. The walls stretched and bent, warping into grotesque shapes. I felt myself being pulled into a vortex of darkness, the whispers growing deafening. The ghostly figures surrounded me, their faces a blur of anguish and torment. In a final act of desperation, I reached for the journal on the desk, flipping through its pages. The words were a jumbled mess of names, dates, and cryptic symbols. My eyes locked onto one phrase that seemed to pulse with an eerie glow. The cycle must be complete. I realized then that I was trapped in a loop, a never-ending cycle of disappearances and memory erasure. The people who vanished were not truly gone. They were trapped in this twisted dimension, condemned to live out their existence in torment, and now, it seemed, I was to join them. As I struggled to comprehend my fate, the world around me began to collapse. The shadows converged, the whispers grew louder, and the darkness enveloped me. My vision blurred, and I felt myself being drawn into the void, my body and soul merging with the darkness. In the final moments before everything faded to black, I caught a fleeting glimpse of my own reflection in the mirror. My face was not my own, but that of a stranger, a ghostly figure with hollow eyes staring back at me. The cycle was complete. I was now a part of the darkness, a new phantom in the endless night, doomed to wander the empty halls of the building, forever trapped in the twisted loop of forgotten memories and erased existence. The building stood silent and empty once more, its secrets hidden behind closed doors and forgotten corridors. The next tenant who moved in would be oblivious to the dark history that lingered in the shadows, and the cycle would continue as it always had, and always would. Story 3. The Last Customer. I had just started a new job at a small gas station in a rural village. It seemed like a routine position. Fill up the tanks, clean the floors, and keep the place running smoothly. Little did I know, this seemingly ordinary job would unravel a mystery so dark that it would forever alter my perception of reality. The previous worker had vanished without a trace, and as I took over a shift, I began to notice something unsettling. All the customers who had visited the station in the past few months were missing, with no one to explain their whereabouts. As the days went by, I uncovered a chilling secret that was hidden behind the facade of this quiet, unassuming place. This is the story of what happened at that gas station, a tale of dread and disappearance that will make you question the safety of the ordinary. When I first arrived at the gas station, it appeared to be just another small business nestled in the heart of a quaint, sleepy village. The station was old, its paint peeling, and the sign hanging slightly askew, but it had a certain rustic charm. The air was filled with the faint smell of gasoline mixed with the earthy scent of the surrounding fields. It was the kind of place where nothing much seemed to happen, and that was exactly the kind of job I was looking for. I was tired of the hustle and bustle of city life, and this job promised a peaceful retreat. The previous employee, Mark, had vanished mysteriously a few weeks before I arrived. The management assured me that it was simply a case of someone moving on to better opportunities. They spoke of him in hushed tones, and his name was often followed by awkward silences. When I asked about him, they brushed off my curiosity with vague responses, saying he had left for personal reasons and that they had no further information. It wasn't until I started my first shift that I realized how strange Mark's departure truly was. The gas station itself was a relic from another era, with an old-fashioned pump system that required manual operation. The cashier's counter was cluttered with outdated magazines and dusty trinkets. The walls of the small office behind the counter were adorned with faded photographs of the station's earlier days. Everything about the place seemed to be stuck in a time long gone, adding to the feeling that it was a place out of sync with the modern world. On my first day, the regular customers came and went with their usual routines. I was introduced to a few of them by name, mostly elderly locals who chatted about the weather and the latest town gossip. They all seemed friendly enough, though there was an air of peculiar detachment about them. It was as if they were hiding something behind their smiles. I brushed off these feelings as nerves from starting a new job and focused on getting through my first shift. It wasn't long before I began to notice discrepancies. Small things at first. The missing cash register drawer, the oddly empty display shelves, and the peculiar behavior of some customers who seemed overly interested in the station's history. I found myself alone more often than not, with long stretches of quiet, broken only by the occasional rumble of a passing car. One evening, as I was closing up the station, I stumbled upon a file tucked away behind a stack of old invoices. It was a thin folder marked with the name Customer Records. Curiosity got the better of me and I flipped it open. Inside, I found a list of names and contact details for the station's customers. What struck me as odd was that many of the entries were marked with a date but no address or phone number. It was as if these people had vanished off the face of the earth after their last visit. I began to dig deeper, trying to piece together the mystery of the missing customers. I compared the names on the list with the town's census records and found that several of them were indeed missing from any recent documentation. My unease grew as I realized that these people were not just missing from the station records, but from the village itself. My investigations were met with vague answers and awkward glances from the locals. They would change the subject when I brought up the missing customers or become visibly uncomfortable. It was as if they were trying to keep something hidden, a secret too dark to reveal. The more I probed, the more resistance I encountered. One night, I decided to take matters into my own hands. After closing time, I rummaged through the station's storage room, hoping to find any clues that might explain the disappearance of Mark and the missing customers. As I sifted through old boxes and dusty equipment, I stumbled upon a hidden compartment behind a false wall. Inside, I found a collection of old records and photographs, each depicting various people who had visited the station over the years. What caught my eye was a series of photographs showing the station's previous employees, all of whom had vanished under mysterious circumstances. The images were eerily similar. Each employee was shown standing in front of the gas pumps, with an expression that seemed both vacant and fearful. It was as if they had been caught in a moment of dread just before their disappearance. The final photograph was of Mark, taken just days before he vanished. His face was pale, and his eyes had a haunted look that sent chills down my spine. I noticed that in the background of this photograph, the station's gas pumps appeared to be different from the ones currently in use. They looked old and worn, almost as if they belonged to a different era. My heart raced as I realized that the changes to the pumps, the missing employees, might be linked. There was something deeply unsettling about the idea that the gas station itself could be a part of the mystery. I felt a growing sense of dread, knowing that the answers I sought might be far more terrifying than I imagined. As the days passed, I continued to unravel the twisted tale of the gas station. Each discovery seemed to lead me further into a web of secrets and disappearances. The once innocuous job had turned into a nightmare, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that someone, or something, was keeping a close eye on my every move. The mystery of the gas station was far from over, and I knew that there were still many unanswered questions. I had only begun to scratch the surface of the dark truth that lay beneath the surface. The sense of impending danger grew stronger with each passing day, and I braced myself for the chilling revelations that awaited me. What had truly happened to the missing customers and the previous employees? The answer was waiting just beyond the edge of the known world, and I was determined to uncover it, no matter the cost. The more I dug into the gas station's past, the more I felt like I was unraveling a sinister puzzle. Each clue seemed to lead to more questions, and the more I uncovered, the more I felt a creeping dread that I couldn't shake. It became clear that the station was not just a backdrop for a series of disappearances, but a central player in a nightmarish scenario that went back decades. After finding the hidden compartment with the photographs, I spent hours poring over each one, trying to piece together what had happened. The photographs showed not only the employees but also various customers, all of whom had disappeared under strange circumstances. The one constant in every image was the gas station itself, a dark, looming presence in the background. My curiosity led me to investigate the station's history further. I visited the local library and scoured old newspapers and records, hoping to find more information about the station and its previous employees. What I discovered was chilling. There were reports of strange occurrences and unexplained disappearances dating back to the station's opening in the early 1950s. It seemed that every few years, someone connected to the station would vanish, leaving behind no. One article described a series of bizarre events that occurred in the 1970s. According to the report, a former employee had claimed that the gas station was cursed. The employee, a man named George, had written a series of letters to the local paper before disappearing. In his letters, he spoke of hearing voices and seeing shadowy figures around the station at night. He claimed that these entities were responsible for the disappearances and that they were linked to the station's history. Intrigued, I decided to visit the gas station at night, hoping to witness something that might shed light on the strange happenings. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the village fell into darkness, I prepared for a night of uneasy vigilance. The station was eerily quiet, the only sound the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. I took up a position near the pumps, keeping my flashlight at the ready. Hours passed, and nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Just as I was beginning to think that I had wasted my time, I noticed a faint, glowing light coming from the office window. It was a dim, unnatural light that flickered like a candle flame. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached the office, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. When I reached the window, I peered inside and saw something that made my blood run cold. The office was filled with an eerie, spectral glow, and the silhouette of a figure moved within. It was impossible to make out the details, but the figure seemed to be pacing back and forth, as if trapped in some sort of loop. I could feel a cold sweat breaking out on my forehead as I watched, unable to tear my eyes away. Summoning all my courage, I entered the office. The moment I stepped through the door, the glow vanished, and the room was plunged into darkness. I fumbled for the light switch, my hands trembling. When I finally managed to turn on the light, I saw that the room was empty. There was no sign of the figure or any source of the glow. My heart raced as I searched the office, but there was nothing out of place. Determined to uncover the truth, I decided to delve into the station's basement, which had been locked off for as long as I could remember. The key to the basement had been missing since my first day, but I managed to find a spare key hidden in a dusty drawer. With a sense of trepidation, I unlocked the basement door and descended into the darkness. The basement was a musty, damp space filled with old equipment and forgotten relics. As I explored, I stumbled upon an old filing cabinet, its drawers filled with yellowed papers and ancient documents. Among the papers, I found something that made my heart skip a beat. A series of journal entries written by Mark, the previous employee who had disappeared. In his journals, Mark detailed his growing paranoia and fear. He wrote about strange occurrences at the station, including hearing footsteps when no one was there and seeing shadowy figures out of the corner of his eye. He described a particular incident where he found a hidden compartment behind the walls of the basement. Inside, he discovered a collection of old gas station memorabilia, including photographs of previous employees, each one marked with a date and a peculiar symbol. The symbol, a strange and intricate design, matched a mark I had seen on the photographs in the hidden compartment behind the office. My heart pounded as I realized that these symbols were not just random decorations, but part of a larger, more sinister pattern. The symbols seemed to be a form of ritualistic marking, perhaps used to keep track of the people who had vanished. As I read further, I came across a final disturbing entry. Mark wrote about discovering a hidden room behind a false wall in the basement. He described the room as a place of dark energy, filled with eerie artifacts and occult symbols. His last entry was a frantic plea for help, saying he had uncovered something that he couldn't understand and was afraid for his life. Driven by a mix of fear and determination, I searched the basement for the hidden room Mark had mentioned. After hours of digging through old equipment and debris, I found a false wall, just as Mark had described. With great effort, I managed to pry it open, revealing a narrow, dimly lit chamber. Inside the room, I found a collection of strange objects. Old books with bizarre symbols, ritualistic artifacts, and photographs of the gas station throughout the years. The air in the room was thick and oppressive, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. It was clear that this room had been used for something dark and malevolent. Among the artifacts, I found a large book bound in cracked leather. The pages were filled with occult symbols and rituals, describing a series of ceremonies meant to summon and control otherworldly entities. The book mentioned a ritual that involved the gas station and its employees, suggesting that the disappearances were part of a larger, sinister plan. As I continued to explore the room, I heard a faint whispering sound, as if voices were speaking just beyond the reach of my hearing. The whispers grew louder, and I felt a cold, unseen presence in the room. My instincts told me to leave, but I couldn't tear myself away from the book and the horrifying revelations it contained. Suddenly, the whispers grew louder, and the room seemed to pulse with a dark, malevolent energy. The temperature dropped, and I felt an icy hand touch my shoulder. I spun around, but there was no one there. Panic surged through me as I realized that the entities Mark had written about were now aware of my presence. With a final, desperate effort, I grabbed the book and fled the basement, slamming the false wall shut behind me. I locked the basement door and hurried out of the gas station, my heart racing and my mind reeling from the horrors I had uncovered. The next day I resigned from my job, unable to bear the thought of returning to the station. I left the village, vowing never to return. The gas station, with its dark history and sinister rituals, was a place I wanted to leave far behind. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that something followed me from that place. The whispers still haunt my dreams, and the sense of being watched never quite leaves me. The gas station remains a dark and eerie memory, a reminder of the horrors that lie hidden beneath the surface of even the most ordinary places.